name's Tom Oates. I'm a faculty member in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa, and with my colleague Rachel Young, we've tried to organize this community discussion on race, integration, and public schooling. I want to introduce our three panelists first, and then we'll hear from them on a set of very general questions that we'll all be engaging with today. So the idea is that first, each of the panelists will speak briefly on the questions, and then each of you will be invited to speak with a neighbor on the question, and then we'll come back for a larger group discussion. Nikole Hannah-Jones, directly to my left here, is an award-winning investigative reporter covering racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. Nikole investigates the way racial segregation in housing and schools is maintained through official action and policy. In 2017, Nikole was named a prestigious MacArthur Fellow for her reporting on school segregation. She is writing a book on school segregation entitled The Problem We All Live With, to be published with the One World imprint of Penguin Random House. Next to her is Leslie Ann Locke, an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership Studies at the University of Iowa. Her research interests include leadership for social justice and equity, schooling for students from marginalized groups, equity-oriented education policy, and qualitative methodologies. And finally, Kingsley Botchway works for the Iowa City Community School District and is as the Director of Equality and Engagement. Kingsley holds a professional doctorate in law from the University of Iowa. He has served on many boards and commissions while in Iowa City, especially as a former member of Juvenile Youth Justice Development Board and the Community Police Review Board, and former chair of the Iowa City Ad Hoc Diversity Committee. Kingsley currently serves on the Iowa City City Council. Let's welcome our guests first. Get started. And the two very general questions that we like to engage tonight are these. What does equality in education look like, and what does it require? And secondly, what are some things this community could do better to realize that ideal? Nikole? Go.
I guess I'll go first. Okay, first of all, thank you for having me and hosting this event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a native Iowan. I grew up in Waterloo, graduated from Waterloo West High School, and myself was a product of a school desegregation program called Open Enrollment that allowed me to get out of segregated schools and attend some of the best public schools in my district. So my work, thank you, y'all can clap, that's cool. So I just appreciate being invited back to my home state. I don't appreciate that y'all are still dealing with this shit all these years later. So I start with my biography by saying, if we want to know what does equality in education look like, it looks like an education that I was allowed to receive because of intentional desegregation. Equality in education means that you don't have schools where nearly every kid is a member of a racial minority and where nearly every kid is poor. It means that your schools actually reflect your communities. It means that the resources given those schools actually reflect your communities. It means that you can't predict the quality of the education of a school by the color of the kids in that school. And it means that very progressive communities like yours stop saying you value equality and integration and actually do something about it. That's what it means. So I was actually contacted by some folks in your community probably about a year and a half ago when I understand you guys were dealing with a new high school and some rezoning issues around your elementary schools. And people are like, you need to come here because white people are acting crazy. So it's interesting because I cover communities that have far more inequality than this community has, where it is almost impossible to integrate schools because there are no white people left in the school district. But you guys don't have that problem. You actually have a system that is very easy to integrate if you wanted to, where equality is not a difficult thing, where you still have a very large middle-class population and a white population. So I'll be interested when we break into the small groups, because I want to understand, what is the problem? Why do you not have the will to do that? So, okay, I'm not going to ramble. I feel like other people need to talk. Very quickly, you clearly cannot have in a district like this schools where you have 80% students of color and 80 to 90% of students on free and reduced lunch. What equality requires is those who have always been privileged in this system have to give up some of that privilege, which means you have to stop hoarding the resources that your power allows you to demand and ensure that those resources are actually equitably distributed across the district. And the only way that we've ever done that is to break up concentrations of poverty and racial isolation. So what are you willing to do about that? Politicians respond to what they believe that powerful people in their communities want. So if powerful people in this community want equality, politicians will act in a way that brings about equality. If powerful people in this community say they want equality, but then come to school board meetings and raise holy hell when a district tries to do something that brings about equality, then politicians will respond to that. Linda Brown, who was the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, passed away last week. And there were all these stories and all of these people mourning her death. And I ask myself, and I ask all of you, if Linda Brown were here today and we tried to bring a lawsuit that would lead to forced desegregation of schools, what side of that would you be on? And then that's kind of the answer to your question. And then I'll let someone else answer for now. I don't even know what your other question was. Maybe I'll get to that later.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the folks from journalism for putting this on. I appreciate it, and I appreciate being invited. Can you hear me?
I don't think so.
Oh, how do you? I don't know how to
pull it closer.
Pull it closer to me. Now, can you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Better?
It's so loud. My voice is so loud. So, I think we often think about segregation as being, school segregation as being rooted in something that happens outside of schools. Housing segregation, neighborhood segregation, those sorts of things filter in, and therefore we have segregated schools. Some of my work revolves around looking at how segregation happens within schools. So there are a variety of ways that happens. Most famously, it happens through academic tracking. So advanced coursework, IB programs, dual enrollment programs, those sorts of tracks, those higher academic tracks are often populated by white students and white students from middle and higher income backgrounds. Students of color and students from low income backgrounds are more frequently seen in the general academic tracks. So there's a separation there within schools. Also, students of color and students from low-income backgrounds often experience discipline referrals more frequently than their white peers do. More strongly impacted by policies such as zero tolerance policies, dress and hair code policies, dress code and hair policies, and are in schools with a stronger law enforcement presence. So these things are all sorts of ways students get separated inside schools. Just a few. There are more, of course. Another piece that's important is to think about teaching and leadership corps. The teaching force remains largely white, middle class, and female. Leadership corps is very similar. Outside of the elementary level, secondary principals are largely white and male. So therefore, it's possible for students to go through their entire K-12 experience without seeing a teacher of a similar racial or ethnic background or economic background. So lastly, when we think about these terms, equality, in my field, we like to rely on the term equity rather than equality. So equity meaning giving students what they need rather than giving everybody the same thing. So, and realizing that not everybody is going to need the same thing and that those needs are going to be very different, and approaching equality through equity. I don't know that we'll be able to get there. I have, in my work and in my teaching, I focus a lot on the lack of historical understanding of students and the education core. We have sort of a gap in our understanding of how our country's been racialized and folks have been racialized, and how people, that history of racialization is still rooted in how we see folks today and our the achievement outcomes of students in schools. So we have this gap of historical knowledge, and I don't know that we can get to equity or equality without having a thorough understanding of that history and how folks have been marginalized and how that is still rooted in what we see today. I hope that made sense. Did that make sense? I hope that made sense.
So, I had all this nice opening statement and everything that I was going to say, and then, my two previous speakers did such a wonderful job of articulating the issues before us. Ultimately, I want to go back to the question as far as, what does equality look like in education, and what can we do about it? And, I think it was already discussed kind of what equality looks like. I think that ultimately, from what we can do about it is just courage. I think there's tons of people in the room here today that could impact a school board meeting. I mean, this is packed. And I would guarantee you, if we had a conversation around our reading proficiency for our Black students, this wouldn't be the same number of people that would be there. And so that's problematic to me. That's an issue, and I think you bring up a good point around, this is what our politicians, speaking from an elected official standpoint, see. And so when they see numbers, there's movement. When they get emails or get calls over and over again, days on end, there's movement. You don't want to get those calls anymore. You don't want to have those emails. And you don't want people yelling at you at different meetings, especially public meetings that are on TV that your mama can see. And so to that extent, I think that each and every one of you here have the power to enact that change. And I know that many of you, I can kind of count them out in the audience of people I know that have been at these different conversations have, whether that be via social media, whether that be with your presence at these meetings. But it takes more, because I think that you're looking at the historical impact of what we're talking about. This has been going on for eons. This has been going on for decades, at least in looking at the disproportionality around achievement in our student data here. And so, I hope that our small group conversations can really be enlightening and focus on it from that framework, because, it's tiring. It's tiring to kind of, consistently be at some of these conversations and everybody, leave giving themselves a pat on the back saying, oh, I participated. But ultimately, I'm going to look at the data at the end of the year and nothing has changed. And this is the type of community upheaval. This is the type of activism that is necessary in order to activate our politicians and our leaders to do some things differently. We all know the problems. I think I can talk ad nauseum. I know others in the community can talk ad nauseum about the problems. The question I always have is, what are we going to do about it? And frequently, the table, when we're bringing people to have that conversation, is relatively thin and definitely white. And so that's a problem for me, because I don't speak for my community. And it's a problem for me because ultimately, in order to impact the change that I believe many of you are here that want to see, it's going to take everybody to move those mountains. And so that's the kind of question, or I guess approach, that I would leave you with as we move into the small groups.
Thank you. So as Tom and I were thinking about what we wanted, it's such a fantastic opportunity to have Nikole come back to Iowa and share some of her experience with us. But we really wanted to give everyone an opportunity to discuss and to mobilize. So what we were hoping, and we got a bigger turnout, I shouldn't have been surprised with Nikole on the bill that we would get such a great crowd. But we were hoping we could, even if it doesn't work, to kind of table up in small groups, that you can at least talk to some of the people sitting near you, either the people you came with, or listen too, if you don't feel that you know exactly what you want to say on this topic yet. But we would really like to have an opportunity for everyone in the group to discuss before we come back to maybe ask some more questions of our panelists, share some ideas. But the questions, again, that Tom had raised initially and that our panelists spoke to and that we'd like to give you all a chance to discuss are, what do equality and equity in education look like We know what they don't look like maybe as well. What do those require of us all? And what are some things that this community could do better to realize that ideal? So again, please take this opportunity to talk to those sitting next to you and maybe raise some questions that we can then bring to our panelists in 10 minutes or so. Okay.
For those who came in late, I just want to reintroduce our panelists here. This is immediately to my left, Maya Durham from Iowa City Public High School. She's a core member of Students Against School Shootings. Next to her. Next to her, Nikole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times. Next to her, Leslie Locke from the University of Iowa. And Kingsley Botchway from Iowa City City Council. So we'd like to open up the conversation now. We have a mobile mic, which we will ask you to use. This event is being recorded for public access television. So please do speak into the mic. I can repeat questions if we need to.
Yes, I would like to ask the board, how could people be convinced, generally people who are non-believers in social economic integration in schools and neighborhoods, that they have something to gain versus something to lose?
I'm just going to give a completely flip answer because that's how I am. If I could figure that out, I would have to find a new subject to write about. We were just saying in the small group that we have segregation for a reason, and we have segregation because segregation is beneficial to white people, right? It allows white people to hoard an inordinate amount of resources, to demand an inordinate amount of resources. And so all of the ways that we kind of talk about that integration is important and beneficial, all these kind of abstract kind of, helps you be a global citizen and we have a changing world. Those things are important, but not that important, I think, to white people, honestly, because if you look at who's running companies in this country, who's running government in this country, it's not looking like the rest of America. It's looking like the old America. So I think I struggle with that all the time. I mean, what I can say, for those who care about research and data and make decisions in a rational way, because much of what drives racial inequality is not rational thought, it's irrational thought, right? It's fear. And fear is not something that can be studied away. Racial integration does not harm white children. It does not lower white children's test scores. It does not lower white children's academic advancement. There's nothing actually inferior about black children. Black children just happen to be in schools where they don't get the same resources, and predictably, that produces inferior results. So what integration does do for white children is actually makes them better children. What the research does show is that white children who attend integrated schools are more likely to go on and live in integrated communities themselves and send their children to integrated schools and work in integrated workplaces and actually are much more tolerant and no longer have this false sense of their own superiority, which I think is a very good thing. But if you're looking for, the way that integration benefits black children, which is, will you get a quality education or not? There's no, opposing side to that because the whole history of segregation has been about ensuring that white children get more resources than other children. And we would, I understand I am making a moral argument because it is not an argument where if you're looking at the benefits that most white people would see a great tangible benefit. So I think by making a moral argument, I'm talking to all the well-meaning, progressive white people who love to say they believe in equality, and I'm simply saying, okay, live that value for a change. That's the argument that I'm making. And the last thing I would say, then I'll let other folks speak on this, is I can tell you, I was the black kid from the wrong side of town that white parents were afraid to have in the school with their children. I've clearly done better than a lot of those kids. So if you think about the lost potential, right? If you think about, had I not been given the opportunity to actually attend quality public schools, would anybody know my name and would I be up here today? No matter how smart I was, no matter how self-motivated I was, the answer is probably no. So if you actually care about all children, if you actually care about your country, in a country where half of all children pretty soon being born in this country are going to be of color, you think you can continue to deprive those kids of an education, but somebody's going to have to pay your Social Security at some point. You're going to stop working. You're going to need your country to function. So you may not care about these kids now, but eventually, as Malcolm would say, the chickens are going to come home to roost, and you can choose to keep depriving kids of an education, but eventually it's going to come home to you as well. But that's a long way of saying, how do you get white folks to stop living in racial privilege? Let me know when you figure that out. Anybody else want to answer? That was it? Okay.
That's a good answer.
Excuse me, can you guys hear me? I want to thank everybody for your leadership in this, especially Mr. Botchway, all the work you're doing in the community. And I'm from Waterloo. So
What high school, East or
wonderful, West High. I was bussed.
Me too.
So here we are. I love the way you said live that value. I just spent the weekend teaching an anti-racism and allies workshop in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's called Urban Retreat. People are welcome to come to the one that's happening here this month. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't know that was going to happen. But I think we really need to reconnect the future of education to social justice. We forget that integration was really just an outcome of a discussion about how to get social justice. It was a strategy for social justice. And I don't think we need to really be thinking about how diversity has been mismanaged so much as the content. Dr. King, who the anniversary of the 50-year anniversary of his assassination is in 2 days. He talked about the content, and if we're not looking at redefining leadership in education so that our kids are being listened to, they're leaders in their own education. The parents are being listened to. The teachers are getting the respect and support they need. We need to redefine leadership in education so that it reflects social justice goals. Education is about attaining the American dream, not so much capitalism and hoarding stuff. We consume too much of the world's resources, but in terms of understanding what matters. It's not things, it's people. And so it really isn't about how we manage diversity. It's about caring about each other and rehumanizing what we're trying to do in this country. So let's talk about leadership in education and listen to our children. Really listen to them, not teaching to the test, not keeping parents. There are parents in this district who can't go into the school building because staff inside feels uncomfortable. That's unacceptable. We need to make sure that we have humanized the process of education and that it respects the leadership of our children.
I just want to thank you for saying that. I am a junior in high school. When it comes to having a representation of myself in teachers, I've never had that. I have had one person of color as a teacher in 12 years of going to public school, and that's awful. She's actually in the back. Hi, Ms. Kaufman. Love you. But just not having the representation, not being able to see yourself in education is such an awful, dehumanizing thing. And it feeds directly into the ideas of social justice not being taught really in schools. And it feeds directly into the idea of not listening to the children. Because when you have so many students coming from so many different backgrounds, there's so many teachers who just don't know how to deal with that. And that feeds, I mean, there's so many factors that affects, but now we have organizations like Students Against School Shootings, and we have Students Against Hate and Discrimination in this, in Iowa City, and branching out so much further. And it's creating such a good culture within us, within our students, to get together and talk about these issues when we're not being talked about them in school, and we're not getting the opportunities to voice these out. And I have to say, at City, I have some amazing teachers, and they do create those opportunities for us, but that is not the case in other schools. It's not the case in Central Iowa, where SAS just reached out to, where Steve King, love him, is where he's there, and where it is a largely conservative area where social justice is not, as far as I know, I don't have a lot of experience in Central Iowa, but it's not a core value for a lot of people, a lot of adults there, as far as I know. Again, obviously outliers, always, don't want to make any like huge generalizations, but having this new power within the students, and having these new organizations popping up, and having Never Again, and the youth of Black Lives Matter who are coming out, and they're talking, and they're making these big strides with marching. We were talking at dinner that John Lewis was 17 the first time he got arrested. There are so many. I mean, the change is now. It has always been now. The change has always been the children. The change has always been the youth, and having that be a core part of our education, having that be instilled from our teachers from a very young age is what we need to keep this going. And that means having more people of color on faculties and staff. That means making an effort to have more racial and ethnic and socioeconomic diversity in classes, because how else are you supposed to know what these different experiences are like and advocate for them if you've never been exposed to them? I am one of, I think, 5 South Asian kids at City. I have never, until very recently, seen myself in a classroom. And that's gotten in the way a lot. And I think it's something that needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed immediately. And I think that my generation and the people that I spend my time around are the ones that are going to change that. And hopefully you'll help. Thank you.
Hello, my name's John. Pleasure to be here. You may not surprise you, but I'm from Kingsley School myself.
Oh, yeah?
That's the great school that we went to. And there are other Kingsley people here.
Okay, Kingsley.
Yeah, and so I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Kingsley said and that you said in your introductions. Kingsley mentioned that these things will take courage. And I've read and heard enough from you that the single act that you did that was the most courageous was sending your own children. I believe you consider it courageous, sending your own children to public school. And I think that's possibly one of the big things that prevents school integration, is parents' unwillingness to do that. And I was just wondering if you'd like to comment on that experience at all.
Sure. I am extremely courageous. No, I'm playing. I'm just kidding. So I've been writing about school segregation. I mean, my very first job was covering a segregated school system in the South. I've been writing about school segregation for 15 years. And it was always very easy to understand what the right thing to do was when I didn't have any children of my own. And I remember as an education reporter, I would always be talking to activists and researchers and people who are working on the issues of school inequality. And then you'd ask them where they sent their own kids and where they lived. And of course, they never sent their kids to the schools that they were writing about and the schools that they said we should not allow. And I just knew, even before I even thought about having kids, that I wasn't going to do that. That I just could not be the person who was saying that these kids were not better than, or that these kids were not worthy of less, and that we should not sustain inequality. And then when it came time to have my own kids and make my own decisions, that I would do that. Now, that was before I moved to New York City, the most segregated large school system in the country, and had, my own precious baby that I had to make decisions about. And when it was time for us to enroll, we live in a low-income Black neighborhood in Brooklyn, and our schools are extremely segregated and under-resourced. And I knew that I was going to send my daughter to one of those schools. My husband didn't know at the time. But that's what we did. And I wrote a piece about it in 2016, and it talked about, the arguments that we had, the conversations, the fears, but ultimately deciding that, which I think is very hard for parents to say. Maybe most parents don't actually believe it, but that I don't believe my daughter is better than other kids, that she deserves better than other kids. And we can't say that this system is unfair and then act in ways that sustain that system. And that if I were going to be writing about this and writing about those kids, I didn't need to try to do everything I could to get my own daughter away from the kids that we lived around. And I should say, people say one of two things to me. They say I'm courageous, and what I say to particularly white parents all the time who think they can't do this, you're not Ruby Bridges, right? Like, no black mob is standing outside of the school trying to tear you apart for going into a school with other kids. No one is brutalizing your children in these schools. We need to stop pretending that it's a courageous thing to send your kid to school with other kids who happen to be black. That's insulting, and we need to stop thinking about it that way. Every time a parent comes up and wants a pat on the back for sending their kid to their neighborhood school, I'm the wrong person. I'm not giving you that, right? These are children. Fundamentally, I don't know why we have such a hard time understanding that black children are children, but black children are children. And it is not courageous for my daughter to go to school with the kids that she plays with in the neighborhood, and kids who are no less than her, they just have less than her. With that said, not enough of us make that decision, so it is important to say that, we make those decisions. The other response that I got, which is much less rare, or much more rare, is how dare you sacrifice your child? How dare you put your child in that position to try to live some, ridiculous, naive values? And the question that I always ask back to that is, whose children are we willing to sacrifice then? Whose children are worthy of the schools that are not good enough for our kids, but that apparently are good enough for other people's kids? And I just don't believe that. I believe that we should not sustain schools that aren't good enough for our own children, and that it's not actually enough just to say I'm a public school parent, because we know that there are plenty of public schools that operate as quasi-private schools. Right, that you are allowed to get a private school education on the public dime because your schools are disproportionately wealthy and disproportionately white, and screen out any other kid who doesn't fit into that, and you're not having to pay for that. So it's actually not just enough to be a public school supporter if your public schools don't look like the other public schools in your district. And actually, in some ways, it's even worse. I'd rather you just go pay your money somewhere else and pay for that private school education, because it's not fair to get a private school education on the public dime. So I thank you for thinking that it was courageous. It actually wasn't, and it was the best decision. And if you met my daughter, you'd see that my daughter is thriving. And what's most beautiful about it is she understands that she's not better than those other kids. And that's, to me, the most important thing to her, is like, she is being raised to be a good person, and a person who understands community, and a person who understands that we cannot live in this world and only be concerned about ourselves. Our faith should be tied to each other, and we should be, our children's faith should be tied to each other, because this is actually why integration matters. If your kids are in that school, you damn sure make sure those schools get what they're supposed to get. But if you can just separate all the board people and put them in these schools over there, you don't care what happens to those kids in that school. A New York Times reporter in a high poverty school fucking changes the school, right? Like, there's certain things that just are not going to happen in that school. I can go to that school and say there's a problem, and it gets fixed immediately. The moms who live across the street in the housing projects can go to that school and complain day in and day out, and everyone writes them off and no one cares. And then we say, they just don't care about their kids' education. They just don't advocate for their kids. It's not true. We don't listen to them. This is about us sharing the advantage that we have with those who don't have it. So maybe my kid doesn't get every single advantage, but she already has so many. I think what I'm asking people to do is, if you can give your kid everything else, do you have to take the public resources in an education as well from the poor black or brown child, where maybe a good public education is the only thing that their parent could give them? That's the argument that I'm making. Okay, now, this is supposed to be a panel, and I'm just like lecturing y'all. I'm actually not used to sharing the stage with other people, so but this is my life's work. Like, how many of you guys are educators in here? So you understand, I get very emotional about this because I sit in those classrooms and I go in those schools and I see how first and second and third graders come in there and they love school and school means everything and they see all the potential in the world. And then you see them by middle school and it's already become clear what we think about them and they start to reflect what we think about them. And that is the most painful thing and it's unacceptable. And so I don't care how kind-hearted you are or that you think you have the right beliefs. What are you doing is the only thing I care about. How long are we going to sustain this system? And there was a song during the civil rights movement. It was what side are you on, my friend, right? So I hope all of you who came out tonight, I really am curious, why did you come? What will you do now? If you came here just to like feel a little guilty for a few minutes and then like you did your penance, or are you actually going to decide that the system cannot be sustained? And what will you give up so that the system will not be sustained? That's why I'm here, and that's the things that I want to talk about.
One thing, I work in elementary schools, not in.
Can she get a microphone?
I usually have a
someone else
pretty
had a
good
question.
teacher voice, but so I'm a school psychologist. I work in Cedar Rapids. I work in elementary schools, and unfortunately, so many of those kindergarten first graders and second graders already feel that they are different, not worthy, whatever. And that's what breaks my heart. Absolutely. So it's not even by the time they get to middle school, it's when they walk in the door. And they're disadvantaged by so many of the experiences that they've already had, that it's a challenge to meet those needs, given the resources that are not allocated well.
Hi there. I am a teacher in the Iowa City District, and I work in a building that is very high in poverty. We have a lot of students who are minorities, and I'm very fortunate to work for a principal who has made it a priority to hire teachers of color. And I have seen in my time in this building the change that's made on our students who didn't ever see teachers that looked like them or weren't expecting to, and then they come and they see a large portion of our staff are teachers of color. But that is not the case in most buildings in this district, and it is certainly not the case when it comes to administration, and it is not the case nationwide. I know I grew up and didn't have any teachers of color until I made it to college, and the impact that would have had on my education could have been limitless. I don't know what it would have done. But what do we do to drive more people of color to education and keep them there? Because there's this large level of disrespect that a lot of teachers of color feel in these buildings. When you're the only one, it's scary. There's a lot of pressure. You are suddenly speaking for your whole community all the time, especially if your population is reflective of who you are. So what do we do as a country, and especially when we live in this community where we have an amazing college of education in our backyard, and we're not sending teachers of color and administrators of color into our schools? How do we change that? And what kind of impact could that have on our students?
I suppose since the College of Education person, I should probably start with that, right? So, and as somebody who works in a leadership program, so yeah, you're exactly right? Like leadership is predominantly white, secondary level predominantly male. However, leaders can set the tone for the school, right? And they can set the tone for the district as well. And I think that's where colleges of education can do a much better job of educating folks, right? As we've talked about, we don't live by each other, we don't know each other, we don't know our country's history very well. Particularly white folks get a very one-sided education about the history of this country, and therefore these sorts of mindsets develop, right? Deficit thinking, stereotypes, et cetera. However, we have a responsibility, right? We're the College of Education. Like, we can do a better job of making sure that not only do we prepare folks better, but that we provide an authentic education, right? And recruitment efforts are also important here, right? And making sure that our college and our university is also a welcoming space where folks will stay, right? So there's sort of, my point is sort of multifaceted, but there's quite a bit of work to do in terms of making sure that we have a space that is authentic and will sustain folks, so we can get folks out into the field.
I can say as well, going back to what was previously said around students enjoying school. And so if a majority of our minority students don't enjoy school, they're not going to become teachers. And so I do think it starts at that level to make sure that we're doing all that we can to make teaching exciting. I would also say from the College of Education standpoint, money. And so that's always a consistent concern. And because we're talking about historical inequality and frequently situations where our students of color don't necessarily have the same resources to get into a lot of these programs, we need money. And so, that's another important part where other districts have succeeded in doing some of these things. I would also say to you that, absent those two things, knowing your principal really well, and I think there's another principal in the audience as well, there was a clear focus, at least from my perspective, that was an important objective. And so if one of the other principals that are here isn't, in my ear talking about, do you have any candidates? Do you have any candidates? Do you have any candidates every single day? Or your principal isn't in my ear, do you have any candidates? Do you have any candidates? Do you have any candidates every single day? That speaks to wanting to see true change in that level. I would tell you, I know this is recorded. It's not across the district. I would tell you that that makes it tough because if you're not consciously looking for it and wanting it and desiring it, you're not going to get it. And so I can tell you from a recruitment standpoint, it always helps to say, hey, I have these two schools where they have 24% of their population are teachers of color, or teaching population teachers of color, and their staff is even higher. You're going to want to work here. There's many teachers that are saying, wow, really? In Iowa City? And so, that's a different conversation that we can have now, obviously, here and other places. But I think I want to just go back to the part where you can get it, you can do it. I mean, I feel like so many people tell me it can't be done, but I know situations in our school district, in our schools, where it can be done. And so, I don't understand.
Hi, is this on? Okay. So this is kind of a two-part question, I suppose. Okay. I graduated from the College of Ed here at University of Iowa 4 years ago. And I identify as Black, and I was the token Black girl. They still got my poster hanging up to try to make it appear that it was diverse. It's still not. I still see practicum students, orientation students coming into my building, stereotypical white girl, blonde hair. Oh, I want to go teach the kids. No offense, but that's what I'm seeing. And so not that you have all the answers, but what really is being done at the college level? Because if we don't start with teachers in the classroom who are understanding our minorities, we're never going to get enough minorities into the field due to dropout rates. So what is being done at the college level teaching history, because I had to seek it out myself. I wasn't taught. So do you know what's being done? And then what could you do once more minorities start to join?
Wow. Okay. What could I do? Well, so you went through the teacher ed program. Yes. Yeah. So I'm not trying to evade the answer, but I'm in ed policy and leadership, which is higher ed leadership, and schools, culture, and society. And so I know that the teacher ed program offers a human relations class. That's right. And I don't know that curriculum very well. But I do know that that is one course that gets at that content, and that just I think I don't know for sure, so I may be speaking out of turn here, but I think that is the one course. So,
Language and learning has a little bit too.
pardon me?
Language and learning.
Language and learning.
They have to see that.
Okay, yeah. So it's still very much. It's still very. Katrina, can I call you out? Is that the one course? I know. No. Not okay. Okay, fine. 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 No, no, don't talk to me. Okay.
She is not representing that tonight.
Thanks.
I will say that, the college is making some efforts to attract minority teachers. And so I am not a spokesperson for the college. Hi, I remember you. And so I am not a spokesperson for the college, but I know that there is some effort within the teacher ed program, the preparatory program, to attract diverse students into the teacher ed program. I think one of the things that we need to be clear about historically is that prior to desegregation, we did have a very strong African American teaching force. And with desegregation, whatever you feel about it, there were positives that we gave up. And so also with desegregation integration, we also see that if we're speaking about African Americans primarily, people had the options to pursue other careers. And when we look at, Kingsley was talking about finances needing money, a number of African Americans became less attractive because of pay. But we also have to be very clear about the testing issue. When we started implementing standardized tests across the board so that teachers could gain, and I'm talking about national certification, we also saw a decline. And so there are those who would argue that the implementation of those standardized tests were actually one of the big nails in the coffins that actually, for lack of better terms, killed the powerhouse that we had known as Black teachers in the classrooms. But I just want to be clear that even within the segregated school system, there were positive things that were going on. And there's a great author, Vanessa Siddle-Walker, who talks about those segregated schools. And if you haven't read any of her work, I would strongly encourage you to read her work. She has about 3 books out, but the first one is Their Highest Potential, a segregated African-American community in the South or something like that. But you will understand the strength that was in those schools, and you will see that Black communities are not void of an appreciation and a value for education, that people actually worked really hard, paid extra money on top of their taxes when that money was not being funneled to them to make sure that their children had a great education. And so I'll just wrap it up and say that there are efforts. Historically, I'm a historian of American education, but there are efforts in the college now trying to build that teaching force.
I can answer that question in a different way. As far as what the district is looking at, so recently we've spent a lot of time focusing on our vertical accountability and what we are doing at the district administration standpoint to hold our teachers accountable, and what are we doing what we are doing at the district to have the teachers hold us accountable. And ultimately, one of the things we focused on, how do we have a different conversation about recruitment. We haven't had a conversation about retention, and I think that's another 15, 20-minute conversation. I mean, just in this topic, answering a question. But I think ultimately one of the things that we talked about was how do we change the requirements? And so if we know, we're a big district, and I've been to a number of different I was gonna say parties, but not parties, recruitment seminars, and basically having teachers line up. And one of the questions I was asking is, what are you going to tell me different than the next person that comes right before you? Because I was interested in what they were going to provide that would be different than just a regular teacher coming into our district, but why don't we just change the requirements? Why don't we look at how we can determine that, some of our teachers have cultural competency as a requirement before they come work for our district? Why don't we make sure that there's some discussions around making sure that there is a certain level of understanding of historical implications when we're talking about our communities in Iowa City and in general. There's other school districts that have done it. I've done some research, my interns have done the research around that. So there's other school districts that have done it and done it well. So I think that that's another conversation that we can have that I think forces a different conversation at the collegiate level with, how we can bring about a more culturally competent, more culturally aware teacher into our schools.
All right, I'm going to expose my ignorance here because I think that if there's ever a time to do it, it's right now. But I want to know, how do I organize? I've done what I think I can do in my realm of knowledge to the moment. I've tried some different jobs to get at this problem. I'm taking a leap next year that I hope will also help get at this problem. It's something I've always wanted to do, but I don't know how to organize in the community. I don't know what to read. Give me a list. Give me what do I do when I walk out of this room to sustain the energy that's in this room in my community? That's my question.
Okay, so hi. I think that one of the most important things that you can do is talk to the people who are already organizing. Maybe not about this issue, but there's so many activist organizations in Iowa City that know how to organize, know how to do outreach, how to get their events covered by the press. I know with SAS and SOD, what we've done is we have played to our advantages. We've known, okay, Lou Jane has been interviewed by the Washington Post. We are going to email the same person and say, listen, we are holding this march. You are going to come cover this, or we'll send you something. Knowing how to get the word out about what you're doing is a really, really big thing, I think. And then also just talking to the people who are affected by it, talking to students, talking to parents, parents of color, parents of students who do feel that oppression from the age of 6 years old. And just getting as much information as you possibly can from the people who feel it closest to their heart, the people who experience it every single day, is, I think, in my 17 long years, is what I've seen works the best. And hopefully I'll build on that too.
Maybe I should also just clarify, where do you go with the information, right? I feel like I have people I know that I can talk to,
Mm-hmm.
but who do I take it to city council? Do I take it to the school board? And if so, how many people makes the change? You know what I'm saying? Do I need to get 1,000 people there? Do I need to get into every single board meeting, or just a couple? Do I go to city council all year with all these people? What is the number? Because I feel we're in here, we care.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, Kingsley.
So, I would say, in general, come into these meetings. When I say coming to the school board meetings, coming to the city council meetings, asking the questions. I'm going to call it Latasha because she was just recently on the school board and I think brought up a piece of disaggregating data that we weren't currently doing before. And so that was a very quick change, or not quick change, but a change into the practice of how we were patting ourselves on the back. And so as a high-performing district, you can mask the numbers, so to speak. I think we had a conversation in our group around ACT. Many of our students don't take the ACT. And so that's a problem, or many of our students of color don't take the ACT, and so that's a problem in general when you're patting yourselves on the back as far as how well our scores are. And so I think that coming to these meetings and asking, when I say the right questions, because that was part of my opening statement, but you did so well, asking the right questions is focused on what is happening for our students of color. And so, and I think that's every single time. And so you want to talk about, I'm trying to remember the last board meeting. You want to talk about doing a sidewalk. What about our students of color? You want to talk about achievement and how we're going to put together a program around AP and honors testing. What about our students of color? And I mean, I think in our group we talked about the fact of, it's interesting for me when we have a conversation about our students of color in education. You know, we always will ask one question and somebody gives us an answer, then we said, okay, cool. That's good. That's a good answer. So I'm gonna walk away. If this was us giving $1 million away or some of our savings away to somebody, we would ask them, what are they investing in? Who are they investing in? How long am I get my money back? I mean, we'd ask so many different questions, and it just stops when it comes to education, especially when it comes to educations of our students of color. And so I just ask that we do the same thing. You know, what's the timeline? How are we going to measure that? When can I come back? I mean, that's some of the activism that I truly agree or truly support and just believe our students have done and done a wonderful job of doing, saying, well, it's great that you had a response, but we're going to come back at this meeting, and so we want to clearly articulate what that response is going to be, or what your response is going to be moving forward, but ultimately also we want to be inclusive in the process. And so those are some of the things I think people can do right away. And so, I mean, my expectation is that everybody here would be at the next school board meeting. But I'll be honest with you, do I believe that's going to happen? No. April 10th, 6 o'clock, show up. And I mean, I think again, it's disheartening because we talked about it again. I'm in these conversations all the time, and I spoke pretty plainly, and I guess I'll speak pretty plainly. I mean, one of the reasons I said yes to the panel is I get to see you and hear from you, and that was exciting. I mean, ultimately, if it wasn't you, I probably would have said no, because I'm in these conversations all the time, and then I'll be in conversations where nobody will be there, and that's not doing the work. That's not actually making the change that I think we all are here to support, or maybe some of us are here to support.
I'm sorry, could I I commend you for the question, because the most frustrating thing to me in the world is everyone comes out, hears me talk or someone else talk, and then you just go back to your normal life. So I think it is important to say we've talked the subject to death. We've been talking about the subject for 50 years, right? It doesn't actually require more study. We know what to do. What we need is a plan of action and political pressure to actually do it. The first thing I would recommend that you do is ask the organizers to, at the end, get the contact information of everyone who wants to work on this issue, share that contact information with everyone who agreed to have their information signed, and start actually having meetings where you can organize a strategy. We know that there are things that politicians respond to, right? Political pressure from people who have some sense of power. In the places where desegregation has worked, it's where they have gotten buy-in from the business community, who actually realize that having equitable schools is good for business. It is good for attracting businesses. It is not good to have entire parts of town where people don't want to buy a house or live. That's actually not smart. So I think your instinct is right. Come up with something tangible. So find like-minded people. No, you're never going to get this crowd of people coming to school board meetings who are demanding this. And you don't need it. When we look at the civil rights movement, everyone wants to act like they marched with King. Most people didn't march with King, right? Most people did not participate in a single civil rights direct action. But small numbers of people can actually force change. Small numbers of people, you don't need this whole group. If you have 15 core folks who come to that school board meeting and come to that city council meeting and demand change and are relentless, who, when it's time for elections, ensure that the local media is asking questions about desegregation, making sure that has to be on the platform, making sure that the press is covering that as an issue, then you begin to apply a type of pressure that becomes hard to ignore. It's also not going to change overnight. It's going to have to be sustained. It's going to have to be something that's in the long haul. But make it politically unpalatable for politicians to ignore this issue. Use what power and influence you have on behalf of those who don't have it, but work with those who don't have it, right? They know the answer. I think this was out of the mouth of babes, right? These communities know there are already people working on these issues. So I don't know if y'all can do that, but it would be awesome to just send a sign-up sheet around, and people who want to work on this issue can somehow connect, because I'm disinterested in just having people come hear me talk. I want us to do something different for our kids. And I would love if we could harness some of this energy. And I know that's a hard question to ask, right? Because it feels very vulnerable and naive not to know how to do it. I can't even tell you who. I'm a journalist. I just exposed the problem, and y'all got to fix this shit. Right? there are people who study organizing and who study action, and those are the people whose expertise you should seek out, but your instinct is 100% spot on, and I commend you for that, and hopefully the organizers can make available those in this community who actually want to work on this issue.
We have 2 questions remaining in the queue, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. So I'll go here and then to there.
Hi, everybody. I'll do this with the mic real quick. I was just going to say to the person who was over here, there was a lot of people, so I couldn't really see whose face it was. But you kind of said it, and in a much better way. I can tell you work for the New York Times. I was just going to say that there's no math equation to organizing, right? Like, you've got to come at it from multiple different parts. And yes, it would be great if you come with a squad of 1,000 and just take over that building. But really, a squad of 2 that are loud, that can work. That can roll as long as you have that. And that's really what I was going to say. But between you, ma'am, and Kingsley, who I guess, full disclosure, I work for him, it kind of worked out. So there you go.
Even
I think, can I just add to that? I think, too, you don't always have to be loud. You can just be present, right? I'm not one to, like, when I go to these protests and things like that, I'm always sort of like the quiet one that I'm like, trying to chant. And I just, it's just not, I'm sort of a shy person, so it's not really me. But you being there physically says something. So if you're not, very loud about it, I wouldn't be too concerned about it, because your presence is meaningful as well. And to the point back there about college courses, the pressure works at the college level too. So if you want some change, apply some pressure.
And bring a loud person with you.
Right.
Yeah, get a loud friend. Yeah.
So since my name was dropped, so as a recent school board member, it was a lot of pressure, because sometimes you felt like you were all by yourself trying to work on the desegregation issues in our community, and the nastiness that comes with being the only woman of color at that time who had been elected in 30 years in this community was a lot of pressure. It was a lot. And so what I have found, and what I mentioned earlier, was when we would talk about the fact that Black children were not being as proficient or beyond in our schools, I would get 1 email. But if we changed a bus route, I would get 118 emails. But this is the community we live in, right? And so we come here, we say these things, we're rah, rah, rah. But then this many people are not going to show up to the school board. And then if they do, then the school board has the ability to smile and not respond, right? Because that's a policy. And then they don't have to do anything about it, because you're not relentless, because you don't keep putting pressure on them. You don't continue to ask them questions. You don't ask them to follow up and be accountable about the money that we're putting into these things, hundreds and thousands of dollars. We're coming up with brand new programs that we can't afford, but we have a reading proficiency issue, but yet we have $800,000 for other things. Now the new school elementary boundaries are coming out for 2019. How many of y'all showing up to talk about desegregation then? So my thing is, put your money where your mouth is. Show up with more than 4 or 5 people. Demand that they make these changes. My children are suffering because a lot of you are being quiet. I appreciate other people being quiet and holding the sign. That's great. I don't have time for actors in this. I need you to be an accomplice. If we gonna go down together with me, because it's impacting my life just like it's impacting yours. And if you don't see that and you don't feel that, then you have to think about your own humanity, what's going on with you, because it is a serious problem that we have in our community. I should not have like 4 neighborhood schools and they all are not getting the things that they need, and those children deserve to have the same education as the kids in Coralville, the kids over in North Liberty, and all these other new facilities. It's not right. And until we decide to make that change, because we're supposed to be in charge of these people we've elected, then it's not gonna happen. And you can't just come once. You can't just email once. You have to make it loud, proud, for an extended amount of time, because the system will create new cogs and wheels to go around you. So you have to be persistent. And it just can't be Black people and people of color, because we're exhausted. We're exhausted, and so it's like you can't keep asking for us to keep telling our narratives over and over again because you're causing trauma. And the thing is, there's enough literature written, there's enough videos out there that you should know what's going on in our community. Go back and look at those old previous school board meetings and listen to that before we drag out another group of 16-year-old girls about what is racism doing to you in your classroom, because they've already told that story at least 5 to 10 times this school year alone. So those are just some comments that I have. I really appreciate, I mean, Ms. Hannah Jones, you don't know. I almost cried over here. I'm like, I swear I said the same thing and nobody heard a thing I said. So thank you very much for the echo. I appreciate it.
Let's wrap up for the night. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We have some ad hoc sign-up sheets here. If you want to leave your information on a piece of paper here, we'll compile a list and send an email out so that we can stay in touch about what to do in the future. Next school board meeting, April 10th, right? 6 p.m. Let's thank our panelists for showing up at the end of a very long Monday.
And like really quickly before we convene, I encourage all of you to reach out to the student organizations that are in Iowa City. There's SAS and there's SOD, and there are 3 amazing student journalism programs in the community. We have the Little Hawk, we have West Side Story, and we have the Liberty one that I forget the name of and I feel really bad about, so I'm sorry. But all of our news organizations work really hard every single day to make sure that we are talking about these issues, that we are addressing the issue of segregation and lack of diversity in teachers and violence in schools and sexism and sexual harassment. Like all of the issues that I think that you guys care about, we're trying to talk about, and it'd be amazing to get more input and get more voices in those stories. So I'm the executive editor of the Little Hawk, so if any of you guys like wanna reach out to me, like hit me up. Yeah, so thank you.
So have a final round of applause for our panelists, Maya Durham, Kingsley Botchway, Nikole Hannah Jones, and Leslie Locke. Thank you very much.